is philosophy of film, and it will be meeting in this room every Tuesday at 2 o'clock, and then at some later period in the 3-hour segment, we'll watch a film, if there is a film to be watched. There, as you will see, there usually is. Two things I want to hand out first. A card for each of you. Could you please take one and pass the rest around? Oops, sorry. And syllabus for each of you. Let's start with the syllabus. The first thing I want to be sure of is that you understand about the mechanics of the course. And the best way to learn about that is to read very carefully the paragraph at the bottom. No quizzes or exams, but underlined students are required to attend every class, whether or not there are conflicting exams or study groups in other courses. Arrive on time, which means 2 or 2:05, and do the assigned reading for each weekly session. I'm especially concerned about attendance, so if you have hockey practice Tuesday afternoons and can't be here every week, then you shouldn't take the course. If you are like me, difficult about getting to places on time, you have to make an extra effort the way I do and arrive on time. The reason for that is that two reasons. First, I want to run it as a workshop in which your involvement and participation is at its maximum, and if you're sharing your time and energy during this period on Tuesday afternoons with the hockey field, it won't work. So think carefully about that. And second, since we watch films, we don't have a great deal of time for lecturing on my part, discussion by you, or the presentations that we'll be talking about as possibilities. So it's important to be here on time and stay throughout the 3-hour period. Any question about that? The rest of what you have read or are reading in the paragraph is straightforward and mechanical. Before I discuss the listings on the curriculum, could you please start writing on your cards material for me to get to know you and to help you to get to know each other. At the top, write philosophy of film, 24-13, fall 2004. Underneath that, write your last name in a way that is legible. And after your last name, put a comma, and then your first name. Right? That many people have first and last names that are similar. In this way, I feel I can rely on my memory. After that, could be on the same line or the next line, the numeral for the year that you're at MIT. Is everyone here at MIT? Where are you from? Then after the numeral, put a W. Mm-hmm. No, you're welcome, and you're like everybody else in my eyes. But that way I'll know you're at Wellesley. So if you're a freshman, 1, if you're a sophomore, write down 2, and I think you can figure out the rest. Under that, write the field of your major. biology, computer science, philosophy, or whatever. Don't put down whatever. That gets close to my involvement in life. But nevertheless, you get the idea. Under that, put down the local address at which mail will be received to you. If you're at a fraternity, put down the Greek letters if you want, but also the street address or a sorority, so that mail will be sure to get to you. Under that, the telephone numbers, just a minute, don't write yet, at which you can reach in the order of their accessibility, so that if you spend your life in the lab, that may be the first number. If it's in the fraternity where people take a message and you'll get it, then that could be the first. The point is write them all down, but more or less in terms of how you can be reached most easily by telephone. Under that, and the handwriting is very important here, your email address. But I often encounter, I get mail back from students because I didn't correctly read their handwriting on the email address. So write that very clearly. And you all have an email address. It occurred to me yesterday in my class that maybe someday there won't be Social Security numbers anymore, and on birth everybody will be given an email address. Any question about any of this? And then at on the remaining space, write down the names, not the numbers, of the courses related to this one. Courses in philosophy, courses in media studies, courses in literature or the fine arts, anything that might seem to you as having some relevance. The reason for that is that I want to get to know you better. It's not that I'm going to eliminate anyone. You're all welcome in the class. Does anyone have a hard candy? My voice is starting to disappear already. I keep forgetting. Thank you. That's very nice.
You can keep those there if you want.
All right, that's all I need to have on the cards. What I would like to do is read your names from the cards and ask you to talk about what you want to do in the class. In terms of the curriculum, I have strong ideas, but I'd like to get to know better what your interests are, what you're looking for. So why don't you hand in the cards, and we'll do that next. Okay, Alvin Lynn.
That's me.
Okay. You've had a good deal of film studies, and that's great. What do you hope to expect to find here?
Well, I've always been really interested in film. You know, I feel like there's a lot of things that the average person doesn't see. You know, and so in my classes I've tried to explore film in different ways. You know, so I've taken film music. You know,
With Marty Marks.
Yeah, and I also took studies in
my
film.
My great friend, I really like.
Oh, great.
Whenever I talk to Marty, I learn a great deal. Go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely learned a lot from him. But yeah, I like to look at films in different ways, you know, because you can look at one film and explore like the music. For example, in film music, we looked at Psycho, which I see is on the syllabus, and we talked about the music in that film. But in this class, we're gonna approach it from a completely different way, you know, and learn a lot more about the film you know, things that Hitchcock put in there.
Right.
And a lot of people don't see those things, so I think it's really interesting.
I hope so. There's I have a 75-page chapter on Hitchcock, which is crucial in the book, and then later on, well, I'll explain all that to you. And in the first chapter on Hitchcock, there is considerable discussion in Psycho. Incidentally, let me commend you on your delivery, the way in which you talk. I sometimes have trouble with students who talk very softly, which is all right in itself, and sometimes very sweet. But your way of talking, I had absolutely no trouble hearing whatsoever. And so if you can all project and articulate the way that Alvin did, that'll be nice. Margot Randolph? What do you think? You've had film experience. Black cinema, was that taught here?
It was at Harvard.
Who gives it there?
It was this film director named Isaac Julian. He's from
Agnes
the
who?
UK. Isaac Julian.
How's it spelled?
I-S-A-A-C. Isaac.
Isaac, yeah.
Yeah. Julian is his last name.
Spell that.
Julien.
I don't know him at all.
He's from London, I believe. And he was
Well,
a visiting professor.
There's no course like that here, I think, for what, I don't know why. It could be very valuable. Media, education, and the marketplace. Fine. What do you hope to get out of this one?
Well, basically, I really love films, and so my concentration is in comparative media studies. So I'm just really interested in how filmmakers make films and from what motives they make them, you know, why they make them, and how they choose to present reality. So that's why I want to take
Well,
this course.
one of the things I was going to say in my introduction, but I can do it now, is that I may satisfy some of those needs, but I also hope that I'll convince you that there's a different kind of need that I can provide, because I am a philosopher, which is no recommendation, but it's a different way of approaching things. And when I deal with film, I deal with it mainly in terms of conceptual problems. And given the way I do philosophy, and given the nature of this subject matter, it isn't a history of philosophy primarily, but rather a function of philosophy as I'm creating it myself, as a creative philosopher dealing with film. One reason I said there isn't much of this sort is because until recently, philosophers did not treat film seriously. Hardly any of them wrote about films. There weren't even film programs or departments of films. Film was not considered a respectable subject. I've done a great deal of work on love and sex, and have now written at least eight books. But when I started, that was certainly not respectable, and I was told it would ruin my career, and you can do that in the evenings. It's not what it is to be a professor or a philosopher or anything that would be respected by a university. Well, I ran the risk, and even now it's not, people look askance. I don't care. But in the case of film studies, that was also a taboo subject until recently. If it was done, whenever it was done by people in fields of literature, and then there were enough of them that they sort of, in the last, let's say, 15 years, maybe 20 at most, created a profession of their own, and now it is a very strong, burgeoning profession, and it is strengthened or allied to media studies, which, because that is largely technological or sociological, that's the sort of thing the American culture can understand. In a sense, though this is not literally true, that's where the money is, because The studios and the large conglomerates for television and cinema realize that there may be things that may be coming out of these programs. So it has that contemporary importance in the world, the economic world we live in. Over and above that, people are recognizing that film is an art form and more important in the contemporary world than any of the traditional ones, which still go on. But still, film is really the art of your generation and the next generation, and through monitors of screens of computers and so on, probably as long as the human race will go on, will continue. So that there is a new recognition of the importance of films. I approach it the way a few other philosophers do, in a way that is characteristic of conceptual analysis. My hope is that if I do it well enough, people who aren't philosophers and aren't interested exclusively in a conceptual analysis will get something out of it. That's something you can be telling me about as you get through the course. But you see, it amplifies the background that you've had, and that was the reason I wanted to mention that now. But you're certainly welcome in the course. I may have trouble pronouncing this. Jinhak?
Yeah.
Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, Jinhak, right? You can just call me Jin, the first syllable.
Jinhak Ang.
Yeah, or you can just call me Jin, the first syllable.
Jin. Oh no, I forgot. Do any of you, besides Jin, use a nickname? What I always say is after you give your own name, put a parenthesis and then the nickname by which you want me to refer to you and for people who know you.
Jin, right?
Well, oh, I'm sorry. You were talking about the pronunciation, not your nickname.
No, not really.
Is it your nickname?
People call me Jin anyway, so.
They call you Jinhak. Which do you prefer?
Anything, actually.
Okay.
Um,
All right, that's fine. Anybody else have a preference like that? Tell me your name.
Edward.
You want your Ed?
Yeah.
Or Ted? Why not Ted? Like the senior senator from Massachusetts. Anyone else? Okay, Jin. Jin's a sophomore in computer science, and he's had science fiction, the mind of and machines, so you've had some immersion in philosophy. What do you hope to get out of it?
Well, from what I learned in science fiction, the average society sees film as an entertainment, but I think the directors and the writers put a lot more effort into it and then just produce entertaining stories. So I like to see film more than that and try to understand what the director tries to portray.
Talk a little slower.
Oh, sorry. So I would like to see what the director tries to portray in the movie and not just the entertainment value in it. So, basically that.
Now, the fact that you're in technology or computer science as a science related to technology is also very relevant to film, because film is obviously based on a technology that was invented at the end of the 19th century related to another technology, photography, that was invented 70 years earlier, about 1830. And this itself is a problem for philosophy, a problem for aesthetics, which is the branch of philosophy that deals with the arts. How can an art be as dependent upon technology as film is? In the case of a painter making stills rather than a photograph, let's say, whether it's still photograph or moving photograph, moving picture, he uses a kind of very, very primitive technology, the brush and some paints. It's a kind of, very basic kind of technology. In the case of photography and film, the art form itself is based on that. And how does that affect the contents, the creative process, the reception, the audience response to the work of art? Very crucial. And the first thing you're going to be reading will be a chapter in a book that I wrote 5 or 6 years ago. I guess it's almost 6 years now, since 1998 it came out, called Reality Transformed. It's a book very largely in aesthetics of film, but though there are also chapters that analyze films, so it could count as being a form of film studies too. But the first chapter is concerned about the whole question about form and content, technique and meaning. How do the two enter into the creation of films? And what are the schools of thought that have arisen by emphasizing one or the other? So that immediately you're going to get into the question that you are already sensitive to, I'm sure, because MIT is very, very much alive in all these areas, whether it's computer science or philosophy of science or any of the sciences, about the relationship between the technique and the content of the technique. So that we may be of some help, and your ideas about this will be very welcome. Ed, you're the next card. Ed Duggan is the 5th year. You graduate after this term. That's the usual pattern. In environmental engineering, and you've had 2 courses in philosophy, so you're concentrating in philosophy. I'm happy if we satisfy that requisite. One being the introductory course and the other being metaphysics, question mark. Why? Why?
Remember the number of metaphysics.
Oh, you don't remember the number? No, that's all right. What are you hoping to get out of it besides satisfying institute requirements, which is a legitimate concern?
Well, that's one factor, certainly. As these 2 guys mentioned, Jim, is your name, and Alvin?
Yep.
I think of film mostly through the entertainment value, and I know there's more to it than that. And I've never taken a film class, so. And I also think that I hope that film might be an interesting platform to discuss some philosophical concepts.
Right.
Never thought about it like that, through that medium.
Well, to begin your thinking about it, entertainment, in fact, in the first page of one of my books that you'll be reading, 3 Philosophical Filmmakers, I attack the concept that there is a rigid split between entertainment and art. Nothing wrong in art, high art, classic art, being entertaining. It shouldn't be dreary. And if anything that is clearly for purposes of entertainment is done well enough, it becomes an art. So our thinking about these categories have to be considerably revised. To do it properly, one would have to be working on aesthetics itself, and I used to do that and give courses in that, but I don't worry too much about that. I'm sort of blasé about philosophers dealing with typically philosophical questions, or at least I feel I've outgrown it. At my best, which is not true always, it's like an artist who throws out all the rules, the way the great artists always do. So why should I bother with these technical questions in aesthetics? I just assert that the 2 are not necessarily inimical. The second thing I wanted to say is that my own tastes tend to be very high art, and there are all sorts of contemporary interests, like in action movies, ordinary animated films, games, sensationalistic movies, and that includes the ones that are pornographic. They usually bore me, and I don't get many ideas, and so I don't say much about them in my writing. I mean, other people might. They might you get whatever you can in life, but it's not something that I gravitate towards, and therefore the movies that I show are generally great movies and classics. At the same time, I know that in your generation, the present is very important, and so if I can find something that I have something to say about and that interests me, which is very contemporary, I'll be happy to introduce that. As a matter of fact, that happens in the course which is a sequel to this, that I give next term, called Philosophy in Film, more than it does here. And looking down here, I see that the only sort of recent movie is The Purple Rose of Cairo of Woody Allen, and that was made in 1985, when some of you perhaps weren't even born. So I have to confess that that is built into the structure of the course, because I'm interested in the ideas, and the ideas seem to come to me more out of these older movies than the newer ones. Also, but I guess there is a third thing. Since all of American education is geared to the present moment, history has always been a weak part of American education. History of philosophy isn't even taught much in any departments. In our department, very badly. This year we remedied it with a very good appointment, but ordinarily it's not what departments put foremost. Therefore, in this course, I have an opportunity to convey to you some great works that have ever been made in the history of man, and because they're older, they belong to history, might be neglected in other courses that you would take. Okay. Did you want to say anything else, Ed? Emily Montgomery, you, and I thought you raised your hand. You're at Wellesley too, right? In political science, and you've had some literary criticism and some sociology. Fine. What do you hope to get out of the course?
Well, I've never taken a class in philosophy before, so I was looking through it, and I guess it struck me because I never really thought about the philosophy of film as such, and I liked the element in the description of alienation.
I'm missing a few words. Of what?
Alienation.
Alienation,
Yes,
as a theme in film.
Yeah, that was really interesting to me, so I wanted to...
And you studied it in your sociological courses, I suppose?
Somewhat.
Right. Okay, I think there are various things you can get out of the course. One thing about philosophy, this isn't an introduction to philosophy, and listening to me, I'm not an introduction to the nature of the field or a kind of example of what other philosophers are like. Philosophers often vary greatly. There isn't any one pattern that they have. But I'm different from most other philosophers in being what I call a humanist philosopher and a literary philosopher rather than a scientific one. And consequently, though I was trained as an analytical philosopher in logic, philosophy of the language, and all of that, when I was a graduate student and an undergraduate, I don't do things that way. I've gone off on my own. So I'm not representative. My hope is that you will learn something from what I'm telling you, even if you don't want to emulate me. And students, graduate students who say, I want to do what you do, I want to write about love and sex and meaning of life and film, and, one shudders. And I always say, but where are you going to get a job? Who's going to let you do that? And I escaped, but you might not. And if I were at your age, graduate student, I were doing what I've done now, I published 20 books, but it doesn't matter, I'd be assassinated. Nobody would tolerate me. Maybe they would, because if they knew I was going to go on so doggedly and do all these publications anyhow. But having the kind of mentality I have now that this student might claim to have and want to cultivate, I would never have been kicked out of the profession. So it's very hazardous. So I'll be happy to to be able to communicate with you and to learn from you, and possibly for you to learn from me. But it's not because I'm going to be giving you an introduction to philosophy in general. Right. No, that's fine. No, that's fine. I applaud your attitude. I just wanted to give you a warning. David Nadelnu? How do you pronounce it?
Daniel.
Daniel, I'm sorry.
So,
Did I pronounce your last name right?
yeah.
Nedelu.
Nedelku.
Oh, Sue. Oh, it's Romanian.
Yeah.
Nedelsu, then.
Nedelku.
What? Which?
It's ku.
Ku.
Yeah.
Nedelku. Okay. Incidentally, always stop me and correct me from any reason, but certainly about your name. Who is third year in biology and chemistry, has had a film experience, and French film classics. Tell me, did you watch the films of Jean Cocteau?
We watched Beauty and the Beast.
Which one?
Beauty and the Beast.
Beauty and the Beast. Well, did any of the rest of you? Because it happens this summer, I discovered the writings in film theory of Jean Cocteau. And let me give you a little, you're nodding, Emily, you've heard the name, you know? Well, let me tell you, he died about 1963, and he was a French poet, playwright, painter, sculptor. I don't know anything else you can. Other visual arts, and also filmmaker. And he wrote. Oh, that's right. He was a critic and theorist. And what I discovered were his critical writings. And as you will see, when we get to the free philosophical filmmakers, the reason I chose Hitchcock, Renoir, and Orson Welles is because they wrote so much about films and gave interviews in which they talked about film theory. And that interests me as a philosopher, and then gets to be an entry into studying films from my own point of view with the special expertise that I bring in as being a philosopher on sex and love and things like that, which are relevant to the kind of films they made. So that's the nature of my contribution. And you'll see that as the basis of this whole course and the one next term too. And this summer, I discovered that here was somebody who was a real poet who wrote about the poetry of film more thoroughly than anyone else, including greater filmmakers, Orson Welles and Hitchcock, and Renoir in particular. They were greater filmmakers, and Welles and Renoir speak occasionally about the poetry of film, and that's very interesting, but then they don't say much. They just throw it out. And they know what they mean, and I think I understand, but they don't do anything with it. Whereas Cocteau writes dozens, maybe in total, maybe a couple of hundred pages along those lines. And therefore that fascinated me. And so I wrote a chapter on him called Jean Cocteau and the Poetry of Film. At least I thought it was what I wanted to say, except that I spent 50 pages on Beauty and the Beast, that it ended up as half of a longer treatment, which that would be the first part, and the rest of Cocteau's films would make up the second part. So I'm half through. But I was when I made up the reading list, I was so fully immersed in this, I thought, why wouldn't that be a good way of beginning the course? In general, in the reading list, the slant on each week indicates what we will be seeing in class, and what precedes that is the reading that we'll be doing week by week and that we'll be discussing. So today, after I decided why it doesn't fit in with the rest, but it's something I'm bursting with, so why don't we turn to Cocteau right away? And that's what we'll do today. You don't mind watching it a second time?
Oh, no, not at all.
Actually, I watched it many times on DVD in particular. Did you use the DVD? Of course, the DVD has the best image, clarified, and also has magnificent bonus material. It's just incredible what you get on that DVD. And you've seen it, or that one, or you know in general?
Well, I rent a lot of DVDs.
You don't know this one in particular?
No, not.
No, well, this, I'll tell you either next time or later what you can get on that DVD. So that's what we'll start today. I was saying I've seen it many times, and each time it looks to me more and more beautiful. And I now think it's one of the most beautiful movies ever made. There's another very beautiful movie by Luchino Visconti, who was a great Italian filmmaker, based on the novel of Thomas Mann called Death in Venice. And that is something you'll be reading about, because I have a chapter on that in the book Reality Transformed. And I'm very critical in various ways of that film and the direction. But it, too, is one of the most beautiful movies ever made. Okay, Sarah?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. That's I could have seen your Sarah. Michelle is at Wellesley, she said. Sarah is here, third year, and in biology. But you've done a lot of mass culture, art, mass culture, 20th century art, evolution and development. Fine.
Okay, so I'm not sure how much is going to be covered in the course, but I'm very interested in the way films are received by the audience and in the shock value that films can have and what's acceptable in film and throughout time and how that changes.
Well, there is in this new field called film studies a subject matter that some of the members deal with very technically called audience response, or I think that's what it is, audience responsivity. And so there are lots of technical articles and you can read about that. I am not a technician, and so I don't do just what they do, but I'm also interested in that, partly because for me art is a function of communication, a function of response, which itself links up to my ideas about meaning in life. That's the meaning in life. The meaning in life is to be able to do something creatively which is responded to by somebody else, communicated to them, makes sense to them, and in return, they criticize you, sometimes attack you, but that's all right. Don't worry about it unless it's vicious, in which case forget about it. But being attacked can do a great deal of good, aside from being an honor sometimes, but also it is a resource, because if you are geared to that way of thinking and that way of life, and if you've communicated and you're talking to somebody worth communicating with, however hostile, your response to his or her response will be creative, and that's how the mind develops. So that the audience response is an important ingredient in all of the arts, and I think the arts are paradigmatic of living a good and complete life. So that meaning in life will be furthered by means of this kind of ricochet that takes place through responsivity. So if you have ideas about that, pursue them, keep them in mind. And you'll see a lot in the course will give you material you can go further. In general, there's nothing I've ever done, I say this to all my classes, you know, I've written published thousands of pages on different subjects. All of you can do it better, because you can do it from your own point of view. You can do it afresh. You have new resources. You are different people. You belong to different generations. So use whatever you can get out of me. Throw the rest away. Don't be deterred. Don't be flawed because, oh, he's produced so much. Well, I'm such an old man, too. That's not a virtue. That's a chronological fact. You, with your youth, with opportunities to develop over a longer period than I have, you can do better. You can do it through your response, but you've got to sort of disabuse yourself of the problems in response, which is to think of yourself as just a passive receiver. You can be passive if it isn't any good, but if you're more active, you may find things that you can get even out of its badness. So that if you learn how to look at films, and if you're a real film buff, even bad movies will be useful because they will give you things to develop your sensitivity toward the nature of film itself. So this idea of receptivity is a part of that. Did you want to say anything else? This is Sarah Buckley, and Michelle Kobler is the last. Political science at Wellesley, third year, and introduction to video production, that's interesting, and short narrative. One thing I forgot is, if any of you have a cell phone, be sure to put that number down. Did you all do that? You all put whatever numbers you have, including the cell phone number. Okay, fine. What are you hoping for, Michelle?
Well, I actually think that film is becoming and will continue to grow as one of the primary forms of communication.
It is already.
You know, and that writing will eventually lose a lot of its placement that way. So
Well, that's the problem in aesthetics, because why do the two have to be inimical?
I think because of the attention span that people are growing and developing is shortened. And I think also that film is a lot easier to make now than it used to be. So common people have the ability to produce films in a way that they were not previously accessible to. So in that way, I think the study of film is really important to be able to communicate in the future and to reach audiences that will continue to grow.
See, another way of approaching it, which you'll see in the first book, Reality Transformed, I called the literary and the visual. And there are theorists who say that by its definition, film is not literary, that it's a visual art, and where an author, a poet or a literary author might spend a paragraph or a page or even a chapter describing something, the camera just shows it to you, and therefore, instead of being propositional, saying things, it is demonstrative, showing things. I attack that view as a principle in film aesthetics because I want to say that what we see is a function of language because we are basically linguistic creatures. So if I see a table and see it as a table, I'm seeing it as something that can be called a table. And so the split between the visual and the literary doesn't hold up. So literary can sometimes be very abstract, like in mathematics, and therefore if someone says, make me a movie showing me what the square root of -2 means, that is going to be a challenge, but you can write it down, square root -2. It's a concept that lends itself to a literary or a verbal written expression. That's a limiting case. But for the most part, language that we use is not like that. And therefore, what we think of as the literary should, in principle, also be able to show itself in something that is visual. We are also not only inherently linguistic, we're also inherently visual. And the question for the theorist is to show how the two can be combined, should be combined, and how, with a sensitivity to both, you can perceive things that you don't otherwise. As you'll see in most of my analyses of films in the first and then the second book. The more recent one doesn't have a whole chapter on any one film, but there are lots of films that are analyzed. What I strive for is to say something new and different, not to educate people in the sense of giving them a kind of textbook clarification or introduction. My field isn't film studies where you can be taught how to watch a movie. What I do is to try to express what it is I experience as a philosopher from my own philosophical point of view with my training, but not for the sake of hashing through the history of philosophy, not for the sake of analyzing philosophical concepts the way an analytical philosopher would, but rather with that kind of background preparation, seeing things that others might not. So my entire emphasis is upon perception, but it's my perception, so at least from my point of view, which may not be yours. Whatever virtue my writing might have, it would be because of the value of those individual perceptions. Sometimes I'm wrong, sometimes right, but they're my perceptions. Now, what goes into that is a combination of both the visual and the linguistic. I live in words. I walk a great deal. I live in the Back Bay and walk into class and home. That's 3 or 4 miles right there. I spend a lot of time walking, and I'm always thinking. My mind is always operating. I don't know if it's true of other people, but it never seems to let up. And it's like a kind of constant lecture that I'm giving to myself, except that it's not as organized. And what goes into that is developing ideas, working at words in my writing, whatever I'm writing about at the time, and chapters and rehashing things I have written, so that's linguistic, while I'm also trying at least to take in everything around me, perceiving above all people. And I think sometimes people think I'm staring at them, and the young women think I'm going to pursue them, which is not true, and the others wonder why is he staring at me? I'm staring because I want to perceive what's going around and see the difference among human beings, which is this thing, the general thing that astonishes me, how different human beings are, and how valuable it is to be able to see the beauty that almost anybody can have from his or her own point of view. And on top of that, there are the gender differences. I don't look at women the way I look at men, but it's not because I'm uninterested in what they are as men or as women. They're each different. And since I'm heterosexual, I look at women one way. Since I am also a male, I look at men the other way without having the homosexual kind of interest. But I'm always looking at them as persons, and that involves various levels, including their sexuality and their gender and their intelligence, and why it is that they have their hair one way rather than another way, what it is that they're saying to the world by the presentation of themselves, their body, how they walk, how they look, how they see themselves, how they put themselves into the common experience that I am now in a position to observe. Now that's very largely visual rather than literary. And yet the concepts that go into my interests in people, they're literary. And it's the mixture of the two that when I'm lucky, and if I'm successful, which is not a very large amount of time, I put into my writing. So that this is something worth exploring. Even though film is a visual art, might it not also be a literary art? And then how can that be the case? It's a big problem. But don't worry about it.
Okay.
I mean,
I thought you wanted me to comment now.
Well, we have the movie we're going to watch is 93 minutes, I think. So we've got to stop. Please stop me if I keep running on. At I don't know, about 3:20. Then we'll walk to room 1190 and show the film. There won't be time to discuss it today, but we will discuss it next time. But then next time there's going to be a 2-hour movie, Citizen Kane, so that the course is very compressed. That's why you've got to be here every meeting and never come in late. All right? How many of you have seen Citizen Kane? Well, that's what I thought. Only about half of the class. It's a great film, and some people consider it the greatest film ever made. Orson Welles didn't think it was his best, and you'll be reading in Three Philosophical Filmmakers an 70 or 80-page chapter on Orson Welles, who is one of my great heroes, and I say some things about Citizen Kane but go beyond it. So I thought this would be a good time in your life for you to see it or see it again. But it's not in sync with the reading. So let me show you a little about the reading, unless somebody wants to say something. Every week, except for the last one, I'll expect you to do some reading. The last week, you'll be writing your second paper, and I'd rather you spend time on that than doing any outside reading. And there'll be lots of loose ends that we can tie together to some extent, not adequately probably. The reading is entirely in, the required reading is entirely in the 2 books of mine. That's one hazard of taking a course with Irving Singer, because I teach only what is very vital to myself. I can talk to you this way because I'm creating my philosophy in class. That's for me is what philosophy is all about. Socrates, who's the father of philosophy, but never published anything, and so he'd never get tenure anywhere. He used to stand in the city square in Athens, the Agora, and talk with his fellow citizens. But he didn't just chat idly with them, and he liked especially to talk to young people. So he, like me, I prefer talking to young people because they're forming their minds, they're developing. And he had a method to help educate them. That's why he was such a great philosopher. There are 2 principles that I want to go through very quickly in terms of Socrates. First, that everybody knows reality. He believed that because we're all immersed in it. And that already defeats models that you might have, that science is here to show us a reality that we don't know without science. Well, but this is reality. This moment in time, this place, this experience that we're having together. Your being here, me being here, all of us being different, all of us talking the same language, more or less, and able to communicate to some extent, in a world surrounded by a place like MIT and the traffic on Mass Avenue and so on and so on and so on until you get to the remote corners of the universe. We're all there equally. Einstein, just to use an example, who's a scientist you consider to be perhaps the greatest, he doesn't have any greater immersion in that reality than we do. He knew things that I don't know. He had a genius for formulating theories and helping people make discoveries that I can't do in science. But in terms of reality, he's no more of an expert in it than you are or than anybody is. And then in my own view, this extends to animals, to creatures. I feel no superiority over my beloved pets. When I look them in the eyes and eventually, after they've lived with me long enough, communicate, fortunately, I don't expect them to take my courses. I used to bring my dog in, and he slept under the table. Maybe I have the same effect on the students. In any event, I don't mean that the animals are identical to me. but their reality is just as pure and indefeasible as my reality. It's a different reality, I mean, in the sense that they are different from me. I would say different people, but different persons. They're not people, they're persons. They're different persons. But the reality is the same. That was Socrates. That's the great message of Socrates. He then said, the trouble with human beings is that they have language, and therefore they get confused. Language can be ambiguous. You can tell lies in language. You may not understand the meaning of the words you use. And then there are very abstract concepts which are definitive of the glory of the human mind, and they're very hard to understand because they're linguistic. So a mother cat doesn't have to know anything about the nature of love. And for her, love doesn't mean saying, I love you, my little baby, to her kitten, or make cooing noises to show her love. She conveys her love through her bodily presence, just by touching and growing up physically in a tactile relationship with the baby. And in a sense, I want to say she knows more about love than many people do, and that's including me. And that's why I went into the subject in the first place, because I was aware of how little I really knew of this. She doesn't have any language. She doesn't know what I would be talking about by the nature of love, but she's capable of love of her own sort. Language on a high abstract level, like a philosopher talking about the nature of love, can easily be confusing, can be dishonest, what the existentialists called inauthentic. They can be misleading, and that's where human problems arise, Socrates says. So the job of a good philosopher, his kind, is to help us to make our ideas clear. And to do that, he worked out a logical system, but the goal was to get people who know reality to clarify the garbage in their minds by making their ideas clear. All right? Oh, I see. This arose because I was trying to justify using only my own books. I teach the courses as a way of doing philosophy with you, and a lot of it is already in those books, but my hope is that I'll go on to the next book by transcending it through this common experience with you. And already thinking in those terms, I've got into a sequel to the sequel, and that's where the chapter on Jean Cocteau comes in. But what I really have to teach is not going to be based on what you might read in a textbook or a great work of technical film studies. You can write papers about that, but to get the most out of me, you have to read these books. Fortunately, they're written in a very simple English style and not terribly long. So for next week, I ask you to read the first 50 pages, and I think the reading never gets to be much, well, for that book, much longer. The second book, which was published only in May of this year, Three Philosophical Filmmakers, is longer, so some of those chapters are a little longer. The Reality Transformed is available in paperback. That's nice. And I apologize because the other one, having just been published, is only in hardback, and so the price is more. And I hope you'll be able to find some way of getting a discount. But the total amount you have to spend is not very much, given what your other courses are like. In the next week's reading, I engage in a frontal way the whole question about meaning and technique. My fundamental idea is that the two can't fully and ultimately be separated, that it's only through the acquisition of technique that you can express what is meaningful, and it is only through the meaning that is expressed by the technique that something really becomes a work of art and is worthy of your consideration. You can have masters of technique who write exercises, like for the piano. They're not works of art, they're exercises. You have to know technique, and they're a good way of learning technique. But through technique alone, to the extent that it even exists or can be found alone, there isn't any or much meaning. There may be limiting cases, I don't care. The point is still the same, that technique is in itself doesn't provide meaning. It's only technique in its conjunction with meaningfulness that you get a work of art. And in the history of film theories, the two have been generally separated. So the polemical burden of the book is to show how to overcome the distinction and the animosity between schools of thought who think of film as being a visual art and therefore a function of technique. And this is the position that many people in the profession take. In the arts generally, people who teach you the arts are going to shudder if you say, oh, I'm interested in this because it's such fun, because it tells you what life is like, or tells you a story and then they repeat the story. The instructors feel it's their role in life to force you to learn the technique, how the film is put together, what the methodology is, the placement of the camera, and all of the technical things that go into the making of movies, and the other similar but different techniques that go into the making of poetry or music, whatever the art is. Now, I'm not a vulgarian who wants to say all of that is academic baloney. It's very important to learn technique, but it's equally important to realize that if you live at the level of technique, you're missing a great deal, not only in art but in life. The trick is to be able to master a technique, whether it's learning how to play the piano or the violin, in which case you won't go anywhere if you don't master the technique. Though that is a matter of degree too. Do any of you know the great singer Luciano Pavarotti? You've surely heard the name. Well, Pavarotti, I think, is a great tenor. He can't read music. So much for technique. He learns music by ear, and then maybe, I don't know if he plays records over and over again, he memorizes the sounds and then expresses the music accurately from his own point of view, through his own meaningfulness. So as far as technique in that respect, in particular, he's deficient. And whenever I see videos of great singers, which I'm very much interested in, they often have interviews with their teachers or coaches or film experts who know much more about technique than I do, so I found that interesting. But what I find intriguing is they're often saying, well, you know, Schipa or Gigli or Caruso or Domingo or Pavarotti, he was good in this sort of technique, and that he was not so good. That wasn't, you know. So there are all these fine perceptions one can make about the technical ability of even great artists. The first thing is that they've got to have some technical ability or they can't be artists at all. And the greater the technique, the greater they'll be as artists, provided it's not merely a function of technique. What is the rest? The rest is something, talking loosely, to say about the world, having a sense of meaning and being able to express it through their music. And when I hear other videos, I'm always alert to the fact that someone says, what's the great Menuhin, Yehudi Menuhin, had a great mystical sense and of purity and charm that goes into his playing, and it's true. There's something very special about Menuhin, of this highly spiritual kind of violin playing, which is absolutely accurate and technically superb, and yet it's him. It's like hearing someone's voice. And with great singers, for me the greatest of them all is Placido Domingo. The minute I hear a note, I know it's him. I know it's him. It's his voice, and it's because it's his view of the world, his ability to express himself, and I find that very important. I want to just one bit further. There's another great singer, in her field maybe the greatest, and that's Marilyn Horne. And I was present at the memorial service for a friend of mine who had died, and she sang. The minute, and I'd listened and didn't have any special feelings, but the minute I heard the first note of her voice, I burst into tears and was convulsed, and my daughter was sitting next to me, and all the elegant women on the other, dressed up women on the other side, they were shuddering and they're moving away from me. And I couldn't control myself, and it was all because of that first note in the voice of that great mezzo-soprano Marilyn Horne. So that there is something in the world as they see it, as they convey it, as they find meaningful in terms of feelings that they are able to convey, presumably related to their own feelings, but it's not an autobiographical thing. It's a question of expressing feelings that will touch the soul and the heart and the emotions and the sexuality of the audience. That's where the meaning comes in, and it's worthless, it's sheer garbage if it isn't supported by an adequate kind of technique. So there's no separation. That's the basis of what you'll be reading in the first 50 pages, together with an introduction to the two schools that I'm trying to transcend, and some history in the philosophy of film, theorizing about film. Now, in general, it would be good to control my verbosity, and one way of doing that is to have people make presentations, which worked last year in this course very well, but I want you to agree to that. Would people be willing to do that? Every week you give a short presentation. You can write it out, you can speak it, you can talk as long as you want or as short as you want. You're not going to be graded. It's a workshop. The virtue of it is that you bring up problems that others have not thought of, and then there can be some conversation from your point of view, not mine. Here you're going to be swamped by writings by me. This is an opportunity for you to develop in the discussions that will be coming from one of you. In the evaluations I had in one course in which I did this last year, there was one comment that worried me a little. The person said, it says, what do you like and what don't you like? And the person says, I didn't like the idea of having presentations. I found that it inhibited my doing the reading, because if someone's coming in and telling me about it, why do I have to do it? Well, that's not the idea. The idea is that you do it because you have ideas, and the person who comes in has ideas that he or she has spent more time on, and then can direct the conversation in terms of something that will be meaningful to all of you. Can we do that? All right. Think about it for the rest of the course, but somebody should volunteer for next week. Anybody want really to do that? Also, that person should watch the movie beforehand and then come in with any ideas. There's so much material in the course, you can be flexible about how you do this, but it's a slightly different function that the person giving the presentation has. Who would like to do it next week? Maybe somebody who knows Citizen Kane and would like to, having read the first 50 pages, say, oh, that gives me a different way of seeing it.
Yeah, I'll do it. I'll do it.
Great. Fine. That's Lynn, isn't it?
Yep.
All right. How much time do we have? Not very much. I think we should stop right now and go to unless there's something you want to say. Next term, I'll tell you more about the coming weeks, but I think you're launched. Is there anyone who has a card for me to sign, an ad card for the course?
I do.
Okay, give it to me now. Otherwise, we now go to room 190, which is fairly close down the stairs.